Hello, 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 and welcome back. We are in session 2 of our Nutrition Basics class, and this week I'm very excited. We are going to be talking about carbohydrates, and this is a topic that I am particularly passionate about because there is so much new research available, new data coming through, and new thinking in the nutrition and medical fraternity about the importance of carbohydrates, what they do in the body, and what kind of health consequences there are if we don't eat the correct carbohydrates in the correct proportion. So, a focus on carbohydrates is so important from the perspective of health, vitality, wellness, longevity, and just how you feel in general day to day. So, in this session, we are going to chat about what carbohydrates are. We're not going to go into hectic organic chemistry kind of detail, but it's important for you to understand what carbohydrates are and how they are metabolized in your body. And then we're going to focus a little bit on insulin, which is the hormone that is made in your body, and that is what controls generally your blood glucose metabolism and your blood glucose level. So carbohydrates, it's quite a wide group of foods and products that contain carbs. And this includes potato, pasta, rice, bread, anything made from wheat flour, your cereals, but also remember that honey is a carbohydrate and it's actually very, very high in sugar, similar to sugar itself. And it's important to be able to recognize what carbohydrates are when you go shopping, and we'll talk later in the course about how to read food labels, and you'll become very, very good at figuring out which carbohydrates are good and which carbohydrates are not so good for you. If we look at the molecular structure of carbohydrates, they are pretty much all similar. And if you think of a starch, so this is something like your white potato, for instance, your bread, your pasta. That is a carbohydrate in the form of multiple sugar molecules that have all been bound together and connected in quite a big structure, like a big chain. I don't know whether you remember playing as a kid with those plastic, they were like colorful plastic interconnected little toys that could stick together and lock into each other. Essentially, that's what carbohydrates look like, is that they're sugar molecules that are all locked together in a big chain. So starches are those big molecules, and then you get sugars. And the simplest form of sugar, particularly in our nutritional kind of perspective, is glucose. But glucose can bind to other sugars and form additional sugars. So for instance, a glucose plus a fructose molecule bound together gives you sucrose, which is the normal kind of white table sugar that we use in our tea or in our baking. Whereas a glucose plus a galactose molecule is lactose, and that's the sugar that's found in milk and dairy products. So you can understand that then when we think of the metabolism and the absorption of these molecules, they might be slightly different. When we eat a starch, or what we call a complex carbohydrate, so remember that's the molecule where all these multiple sugar molecules are bound together, they get broken down and digested by the physical digestion process, so the chewing and the churning in your stomach, as well as enzymes. Those are the chemicals that break food into smaller particles. So those big complex molecules get broken down into individual sugar molecules, which can then be easily absorbed through the lining of the intestine because they're nice and small and they also dissolve in water. I have a few rules when we think about carbohydrates, and I'll chat briefly about each of those. The first is that all carbohydrates are the same. So, as you've seen previously, all carbohydrates are sugar molecules that are stuck together. When we digest them, they break down into smaller sugar molecules or free sugar molecules. So, regardless of whether you are having the white sugar that goes in your tea or you are having brown rice, the carbohydrate content, the glucose that your body is going to get from that carbohydrate, mass per mass, is essentially the same. But having said that, not all carbohydrates are the same. So if we think of that example between white sugar and brown rice, for instance, the white sugar is easily absorbed. It doesn't take a lot of energy to break it down, and those sugar molecules are pretty quickly free to be absorbed into the system, to go into the blood, and to then trigger an increase in your blood sugar levels. Brown rice, on the other hand, contains additional things. So besides the carbohydrate that's in there, you'll also find fiber and you'll find proteins. So the digestion effort to break down and release that carbohydrate is a lot more, and it takes a lot longer for those sugar molecules to then be in an absorbable form, which means that it probably won't cause as a dramatic spike in your blood sugar level, and the spike will probably be over a longer period of time. So those are what we call lower glycemic index carbohydrates, and we'll talk a bit about that in a short while as well. The other thing to remember is that you do need some carbohydrates. So your brain functions well on glucose. It's the favorite kind of energy source for your brain. You can function on what we call ketones, and these are the breakdown products of fats, but it takes a bit of time, it takes a bit of training for you to make a switch, particularly for your brain to make a switch from preferring glucose to being happy to use ketones for energy. So most people will find that they function better when they do have a little bit of carbohydrate in the diet. And your brain uses about 5 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And that's in a sort of a resting, sleeping state, not when you're doing high level kind of trigonometry or big calculations or thinking about planning your wedding or, stuff that takes a lot of energy. Just in a sleep mode, your brain uses about 5 grams of carbohydrate or glucose per hour. So per 24 hours, you're looking at about 120 grams total that your brain needs to function optimally. It's not a huge amount, but it is something. And obviously, there are sources of carbohydrates which are unprocessed and in a good natural form, like vegetables and fruits, which will give you that 120 grams in the healthiest kind of format. But remember, you do need some carbohydrates. The last factor that I'd like to emphasize, knowing all of these things, that carbohydrates all break down in the same way into glucose or into sugar molecules, but some carbohydrates are certainly better than others from a metabolic perspective, and that you do need some carbohydrates in the body, is that you need to be empowered to choose your carbohydrates wisely and to choose the carbohydrates that will give you the best metabolic benefit for what you want to achieve. So we're going to chat a little bit about that now. The first thing that I'd like to tell you about when we're thinking about how to choose carbohydrates is something called the glycemic index. Now, what that means is that almost every food in the world has been assigned a glycemic index. This is a number, and that compares how your body processes that particular food to how your body would use pure white sugar. So pure white sugar is given a glycemic index of 100. Foods that have a less dramatic effect on your blood sugar levels will have a lower glycemic index, and foods that have a significant effect on your blood sugar level will have a higher glycemic index. It is possible to have a higher glycemic index than 100, and I believe that glucose is the one thing that can do that, because remember, glucose is not exactly the same as the white sugar that you put in your tea. But generally, the comparison is made to white sugar. So if you have a look at this list, let's take, for example, spinach. Spinach has a glycemic index of 15, which is actually a very nice low glycemic index. What that means is that spinach will cause a much less dramatic increase in your blood sugar level than what would happen if you ate the same amount of white sugar as what you are eating in spinach. Now, let's compare that to spaghetti, for instance. Now, spaghetti, you know, is a carbohydrate that has a glycemic index of 42, which is still a nice, relatively low glycemic index compared to sugar, but obviously significantly more than what would have been your spinach. Interestingly, look at white bread. Now, we think of white bread as a starch because it's not sweet. And if you look at it under a microscope, those molecules of carbohydrate are actually pretty complex. But it has the same glycemic index as white sugar, which means that if you eat a slice of white bread, your body will respond in exactly the same way as if you ate the equivalent amount in white sugar, which is quite a frightening thought. Rice also has a high glycemic index, very similar when we're talking about white rice, quite similar to sugar. So I'd like you to take a little bit of time to look at the glycemic index and look at certain foods that you eat frequently and familiarize yourself with the glycemic index of those foods. It's very helpful to gain a little bit of insight into what you do on a day-to-day basis, and maybe you'll then be able to make a little bit better choices as far as the type of carbohydrates that will give you a better metabolic benefit. Generally, I say to people, try to choose lower glycemic index carbohydrates because they tend to have more fiber, they tend to have more vitamins and minerals, they tend to have more protein, and they tend to have much more nutritional benefit than carbohydrates that have a high glycemic index, because high glycemic index carbohydrates tend to be more processed, more refined, and have a negative impact on your metabolism. So here are a few rules when you are shopping, particularly for carbohydrates. The first thing is that white is bad. So if you have a choice between white bread and a nice dark brown dense bread, preferably choose the darker color. Again, that means more fiber, more protein, more additional nutrients in general. The second thing is read the labels. I prefer that if you're going to have a big portion of something, that a single serving of that food should not give you more than 10 grams of carbohydrates in general. simply because you are going to combine that food with other things that will probably also give you some carbs. And remember, we don't really want to have significantly more carbohydrates than about 120 grams per day, because that keeps our brain happy and our metabolism happy at the same time. Choose lower glycemic index carbohydrates, and if the label also says low GL, this means low glycemic load, then we are very happy people, because the glycemic load refers to not only the glycemic index, but the total amount of carbohydrate in a serving of that food. So low glycemic index and low glycemic load is excellent. Choose higher fiber carbohydrates. So generally, if you're looking at a food label and you're reading the per serving amount, that should be 5 grams or more of fiber, because then you know that this is going to be good for your tummy, and it's also going to release more slowly into the blood system. And go for minimally processed carbs, either whole grains or in their whole state, or wild grains or wild rice, because then we know that all the good stuff has not actually been removed by processing. Nature is an amazing thing. We are provided with everything that we need in terms of nutrition by Mother Nature. And it's only through processing and mechanization and changing those food products so that they're more marketable that actually we destroy a lot of the nutritional value. So if you can have foods that are real, that your great-grandmother would have recognized, and that have been minimally changed from their raw natural state, you are going to be winning. And think about what are the added nutrients and the added benefits that you can derive from the carbohydrates and, in fact, all the foods that you're eating in general. There's also a useful trick that you can use when cooking. For things like potatoes, rice, pasta, any of the starchy foods, if you cook them a day ahead, allow them to cool completely and then reheat them before you serve them. What happens is that the molecular structure changes a little bit. So remember that image of the string of carbohydrates, those sugar molecules that are all stuck together? What happens when you cook, you cool, and then you reheat is that the glue that holds those sugar molecules together becomes much stronger. So, number one, it takes a lot more digestion effort for your body to then break down those more complex structures. The second thing is that the sugar is released in a much slower form over a longer period of time. And the third thing is actually that you don't absorb that much. So the amount of energy that you're going to get from a bowl of pasta that has been cooked, cooled, and reheated versus the pasta that you've just cooked is actually quite a bit lower in terms of what you can absorb. So this is a neat trick to use when you want to hack your carbs. People often ask me, can I have fruit juice? Because there is some thinking around the sugar content, etc. My personal feeling is that when we talk about fruit juice, we talk about extracting things from their natural form, is that it's probably better to eat the fruit. If you compare the glycemic index of a whole orange and you compare that to the glycemic index of orange juice, you will see that a whole orange is classified as low glycemic index, whereas the orange juice is classified as high glycemic index. So that means the amount of sugar that's going to be released into your system is significantly higher when you take it in a juice form. The amount of sugar that you have is a lot more. So think about in one orange, which is generally what people would eat, the total grams of sugar is about 12 to 13 grams. You need about between 3 and 4 oranges actually to make a glass of 200 milliliters of orange juice. And the amount of sugar is double, sometimes even 3 times what you would have if you've eaten the whole fruit. So there's a lot more sugar in juice form. The other thing is that when you juice something, you remove the fiber. And fiber is very, very important from the perspective of gut health, from the perspective of avoiding constipation, and also for the benefits on blood cholesterol levels. So I prefer that you eat your fruit in its whole form, or rather have it as a smoothie where it's simply just broken up rather than doing a juice extraction. Now we're going to talk about insulin for a few minutes. Insulin is the hormone produced by the pancreas in the body that responds when your blood sugar increases. And the function of insulin, if you look at this diagram, this is a picture of one of the body cells, one of the cells in your body. On the outside of the cell is the bloodstream. And you can see that there are some glucose molecules in the bloodstream. And there's a little gate on the wall of the cell, the membrane of the cell, that will allow the glucose to move in and out of the cell. And obviously, the cell will use the glucose for energy, for its day-to-day function, or it will process the glucose and keep it for storage. But the glucose has to come from the bloodstream into the cell. And insulin acts like the key that unlocks the gate on the cell membrane. So it's like a drawbridge, really, if you think of a castle and you need to get into the castle, you need to have some kind of magic word to open the drawbridge and allow you to get inside. And so insulin is that magic word that opens the membrane of the cell and allows the sugar molecule to get into the cell where it can be used. And that's how insulin decreases the blood sugar level, is that it pushes the glucose from the blood into the cell. Now, in normal circumstances, insulin works well, meaning that the membrane protein or the gate, that's like the drawbridge, is responsive to the message that insulin provides. So the door will open, the sugar will come into the cell, and the blood sugar level will be nice and normal. However, sometimes we have a situation where the membrane doesn't respond well to insulin. And this is what we call insulin resistance. And it's a very common problem throughout the world at the moment because of the types of foods that we eat. So generally, when there's a lot of glucose coming into the system, the membrane becomes a little bit fed up and a little bit overwhelmed. And it's like the guy at the drawbridge saying, you know what, I'm sick and tired of these people knocking on the door. I'm just not going to listen to them. So you need to have more and more and more insulin in order to open that membrane and in order for the glucose to get into the cell. And this is what we call insulin resistance, where the cell does not respond to the normal stimulation from insulin. And so over time, what will happen is that eventually the insulin just won't work anymore at all. And that is when we end up with diabetes. So what is important to combat insulin resistance is to then get the receptor working well again, or the drawbridge, the gate on the wall of the cell to listen to insulin again. And we need to reduce the need in the body for insulin. And the way to do that is really through controlling the amount of glucose that comes into the system. And diet is probably the most important way to do that. Obviously, there are other factors that contribute to insulin resistance, like genetics, your sleep, your stress, and your physical activity. But the amount of glucose that is coming into your body is the primary and probably most important factor that contributes to insulin resistance, or the resistance of your cells to respond to the message of insulin and to keep your blood sugar under control. And that's really where the focus of our nutritional intervention must be, is to combat the amount of glucose coming into the system so that we don't need so much of insulin. Obviously, this is just an introductory lecture into insulin resistance, and there's a lot more detail that we could go into, but I'm sure we'll touch again on it as we progress through the course. I hope that this has been a useful and interesting session for you, and that you've had some value and some benefit from it. And I'm looking forward to see you in the next session. Take care.